He never imagined his world could shrink to the size of a small square table in a generic coffee shop, the air thick with the smell of burnt espresso and sterile cleaning fluid. He never imagined the final chapter of his relationship with his father would be negotiated over a lukewarm latte by the woman who had stolen him. Victoria sat opposite him, a portrait of detached elegance in a cream-colored silk blouse, her nails a perfect blood-red manicure. Between them, on the polished, wood surface lay a plain white envelope. It was thick, it felt heavier than paper and ink, it felt like the weight of a life, a history being sold for parts. What they had done to him, what she had done, felt like a slow, deliberate amputation of the soul. But what he would do next, born from this single devastating moment, would change everything. He could feel the tremor in his hands and tucked them under the table, clenching them into fists to stop the shaking. Her expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of sympathetic concern that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. It was the same expression she'd worn for the past 3 weeks, every time he called, begging to see his father. "Michael, he's just too weak," she would coo into the phone, her voice dripping with false empathy. "The doctors say any excitement could be detrimental. You understand, it's what's best for him." And he, like a fool, had tried to understand. He had respected. The boundary, picturing his father, Robert, frail and sleeping, needing peace. He didn't realize he was respecting the walls of a prison she had built around his dying dad. The silence from the other side of the table was a weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision, letting him stew in his grief and desperation. But to understand how Michael found himself in this impossible situation, one had to go back to a time before Victoria, when his life was defined by the solid. Reassuring presence of his father. Robert Thompson wasn't just a father, he was an architect of worlds, both literally and figuratively. He had built Thompson Construction from the ground up, turning a small local business into a respected regional firm with his own 2 hands. Michael grew up on construction sites, the smell of sawdust and fresh concrete a more potent memory than any childhood perfume. He remembered his father hoisting him onto his shoulders to watch a new frame go. Up, his booming laugh echoing against the unfinished walls. "Look, Mikey," he'd say, "we're building homes, places where families will grow. It's good, honest work." Their bond was forged not just in business, but in shared loss. Michael's mother had passed away from a sudden aneurysm 10 years ago, a blow that had nearly shattered them both. In the quiet, hollowed-out aftermath, they had clung to each other. They grieved together, sharing silent dinners in the large family home that now felt cavernous and empty, talking for hours about her, keeping her memory alive. Robert taught Michael everything about the business, not just the blueprints and balance sheets, but the ethics of it. "Your handshake is your word," he'd say. "Never cheat a man out of $1." They were a team, father and son, navigating a world that had lost its brightest light. For a few years it was just them against the world, and it was enough. Then came the creeping loneliness in his father's eyes. Michael saw it on the weekends, the way Robert would stare out the window, lost in thought. He was in his late 50s, still a powerful man, but the silence of the house was getting to him. So when Robert met Victoria at a charity gala 2 years after his wife's death, Michael tried to be happy for him. Victoria was stunning, sophisticated, and seemed utterly captivated by his father. She listened intently when he spoke, laughed at his old jokes, and praised his business acumen. She was, in those first few months, perfect. She organized beautiful dinner parties, re-energized his father's social life, and even made a point of including Michael, asking about his work, his life, his memories of his mother. She was playing the long game, laying a foundation of trust so flawless that no one would ever think to inspect its integrity. The changes were subtle at first, small hairline cracks in the facade. A phone call to his dad would be answered by, her. "Oh, he's resting, Michael. I'll tell him you called." But the return call wouldn't always come. A planned Sunday fishing trip, a tradition since Michael was a boy, would be cancelled at the last minute. "Robert's just not feeling up to it, honey. We're going to a quiet brunch with the Hendersons instead." She began to isolate him, cutting the threads of connection one by one, so slowly he barely noticed they were fraying. She'd twist his words, recounting conversations to Robert. With a slight, poisonous spin. Michael sounded so stressed about the company finances, she might say with a worried frown, planting a seed of doubt in Robert's mind about his son's competence. Michael, busy with his own responsibilities at the company, dismissed these as misunderstandings, refusing to believe in the malice that was so carefully hidden behind her perfect smile. He loved his father, and because his father seemed happy, he ignored the warning bells that were beginning. To chime faintly in the back of his mind. And then things began to change for real, the subtle manipulations escalating into a full-blown siege. After she and Robert married, Victoria consolidated her power with breathtaking speed. The first to go were the loyal household staff. Maria, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 20 years and was like a second mother to Michael, was let go for a breach of privacy. David, the driver who had shared countless conversations with Robert over the decades was suddenly deemed unnecessary. They were replaced by her own people, faces that were loyal only to her. Next, she turned her attention to the house itself. Under the guise of modernizing, she began a systematic erasure of Michael's mother. Family photos were taken down from the walls and replaced with abstract art. His mother's favorite armchair was donated to charity. The rose garden she had lovingly tended was dug up to make way for a minimalist stone. In patio. Each change was a small, sharp stab, a declaration that the past was dead and she was the new queen. The humiliations became more direct. At family gatherings, she would make thinly veiled comments about Michael's single status or his lack of ambition, always with a sweet smile that made him look paranoid if he objected. His father, once his staunchest defender, began to change. Robert became more withdrawn, more irritable. Victoria would explain it away as stress from work or the natural effects of aging. But Michael saw something else. He saw a man being slowly worn down, his confidence eroded, his instincts dulled. Robert began to second-guess Michael's decisions at the company, something he had never done before. He started attending meetings with lawyers Michael had never heard of, meetings Victoria had arranged. When Michael tried to ask about them, his father would become defensive. "Victoria is just helping me get my affairs in order, son. It's..." Responsible. The day Robert collapsed at a board meeting was the day Victoria's trap slammed shut. The diagnosis was brutal, late-stage pancreatic cancer, terminal, weeks, maybe a month, the doctor said. From that moment, Victoria became the sole gatekeeper. She cited doctor's orders, Robert's fragile state, the need for absolute calm. Michael's frantic calls went to her voicemail. His texts were answered with terse clinical updates. He had a peaceful night. The medication is... making him sleep. He drove to the hospital countless times, only to be met by a stern nurse at the front desk. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson is not accepting visitors. Family instructions." He was family. He was his son. But in the cold, bureaucratic world of the hospital, Victoria, the wife, held all the power. The siege was complete. His father was dying behind enemy lines, and he was utterly powerless. Which brought him back to this coffee shop, 2 days after a doctor had called him. Unofficially, a man who knew his mother and whispered, "He doesn't have much time, Michael. Maybe a couple of days. You should be here." That call had spurred him to action, a final, desperate message to Victoria demanding to meet. And she had agreed, almost too easily, suggesting this neutral, impersonal place. Now he understood why. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a final, dismissive transaction. Victoria finally leaned forward, her mask of sympathy dropping to reveal the cold. Hard ambition beneath. "Your father is dying, Michael," she said, her voice low and even. "He'll be gone in days. I'm trying to make this easy for everyone." She pushed the white envelope across the table. It slid to a stop just inches from his hand. "There is $1,000 in there. It's a gift, a gesture of goodwill." Michael stared at it, his throat closing up. $1,000. An insult so profound it was almost surreal. "You take this," she continued, her voice hardening, "and you walk away. You don't come to the funeral. You don't contact any lawyers. You don't contest the will. You simply disappear. You get to start fresh, somewhere else, without a messy, expensive legal battle you can't possibly afford." His vision blurred with tears. The world dissolved into a smear of muted colors, the only clear thing in his entire universe being that white envelope. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He tried to speak, to scream, to curse her, but no words came out. He saw his father's face in his mind, laughing, strong, vibrant, and then the image of him lying alone in a sterile hospital room, waiting for a son who would never arrive. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. With a hand that felt like it belonged to a stranger, he reached out, his fingers trembling as they closed around the envelope. He felt the crisp edges of the bills inside, $1,000 to forget. His father. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't bear to see the triumph he knew would be in her eyes. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and stumbled out of the coffee shop, the bell on the door chiming his pathetic retreat. He was a son who had just sold his father's memory for a pittance, a broken man walking away from the only thing that ever mattered. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Victoria alone at the table. A faint, victorious smile finally. Gracing her lips. The first few days were a blur of shame and a grief so profound it felt like drowning in slow motion. He was staying on the couch at his friend Sarah's small apartment, a place that felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. Every morning he'd wake up to the unfamiliar sounds of city traffic instead of the quiet hum of the suburbs, and for a blissful, terrible second, he'd forget. Then the memory would crash down on him. The coffee shop, the white envelope, the look on... Victoria's face. He'd curl up on the cushions, the $1,000 still tucked in his jacket pocket like a cancerous growth, and the tears would start. They were hot, silent tears of a man who had lost everything twice over. First his father's presence, and then his own self-respect. He couldn't eat. The thought of food was nauseating. Sleep came only in short, frantic bursts, filled with nightmares of hospital corridors and locked doors. He felt the humiliation like a physical cloak. People knew. The story of Robert Thompson's illness was whispered among the city's business elite. Michael, the devoted son, suddenly absent. The gossip must be circling like vultures. He tried calling the hospital again, using a different name, asking for the nurse's station on his father's floor, but the wall was impenetrable. "Family instructions," they'd repeat, their voices polite but firm. He tried his father's cell phone, a desperate, foolish hope that he might answer. It went. Straight to Victoria's voicemail. He sent a text. "Dad, I love you, please, I need to see you." He imagined Victoria reading it, a smirk on her face, before deleting it forever. The final, brutal confirmation of his exile came when he tried to use his debit card to buy a bottle of water. Declined. He tried his credit card. Declined. A call to the bank confirmed his worst fears. His personal accounts, which were linked to the family trust Victoria now controlled, had been frozen. He was... not just disowned, He was financially erased. He was 35 years old, a capable executive in his father's company, and overnight he had become destitute, completely dependent on the kindness of a friend who could barely afford her own rent. The thought of giving up, of just letting the current pull him under, was a constant seductive whisper in the back of his mind. But on the fifth night, something happened. Sleep was a distant country he couldn't visit, so he sat in the dark of Sarah's. Living room, the blue light of his laptop screen illuminating his haggard face. He had been aimlessly scrolling through old photos, torturing himself with memories, when a different impulse took hold. He opened a search engine and typed in Victoria's full name, Victoria Blackwood Thompson. The first few pages were predictable. Society photos from charity events, articles about her marriage to the construction magnate Robert Thompson, her curated social media profiles filled with images of lavish trips and expensive dinners. But Michael kept digging, going deeper past the polished surface. He started searching for her name linked to her supposed hometown in Ohio, a place she rarely talked about. He found nothing. No high school records, no mention in local papers. It was as if she hadn't existed before she was 30. Driven by a strange new energy, he tried variations of her name, cross-referencing with public records. And then he found it. A small, inconsistency, a marriage license from Nevada dated 12 years ago for a Victoria Black. The groom's name was different, a wealthy real estate developer. Michael's heart began to beat faster. Victoria had always claimed she'd never been married before. It was a small lie, perhaps, but it was a lie. He started making notes on a legal pad, his handwriting shaky but determined. He began to piece together conversations he'd long since forgotten, comments she'd made, the way she would. Deflect any questions about her past. The pieces weren't fitting together. They were actively repelling each other, revealing a picture that was fundamentally wrong. The next morning, the grief was still there. A dull, heavy ache, but it was now joined by something else. A cold, sharp-edged anger. He called the longtime family lawyer, a man who had handled his father's affairs for 40 years. The secretary was evasive. "Mr. Sterling is in a meeting." He called back an hour later. "He's on a conference call." He called a third time. "He'll have to call you back." The call never came. He tried the family's accountant, a man he'd known since he was a child. The fear in the man's voice was palpable. "Michael, I can't discuss this with you. All inquiries have to go through Mrs. Thompson's legal counsel. It was then that he knew with chilling certainty. This wasn't a recent development. This was a coup, planned and executed with military precision over months. And possibly years, and his grief finally, blessedly, gave way to a singular clarifying thought. She is not going to get away with this. He got out of bed and began to act. His first step was a public library, where he spent hours researching inheritance law in their state. He learned about terms like undue influence and testamentary capacity. He discovered that while a person could legally disinherit a child, the circumstances were highly suspect, especially when a new spouse was the sole beneficiary, and the testator was in a vulnerable state. The will Victoria would produce was almost certainly a fraud, or at least the product of extreme manipulation. But proving it would be a war. He needed proof. He needed a lawyer of his own. Using the last bit of credit on a card, not linked to the family accounts, he booked a consultation with a young, hungry litigation attorney named Jessica Ramirez. She listened to his story patiently, her expression growing more serious. With each detail. "It's a classic case of predatory marriage," she said when he finished. "I believe you. But a judge will need more than your word. We need hard evidence, documents, witnesses, anything." He left her office with a flicker of hope and a monumental task ahead of him. Where would he get proof? Everything, the original will, company documents, financial statements, was locked away in the house or with lawyers who were now loyal to Victoria. So he made a list, not of documents, but of people. People Victoria had cast aside. Maria, the housekeeper, David, the driver, Margaret, his father's executive assistant who had been forced into early retirement shortly after the wedding. These were the people who had been on the inside. They were his only hope. He started making discreet calls, using a prepaid burner phone he bought with the cash Sarah had pressed into his hand. Each conversation was a small shovel, unearthing another piece of the buried. Truth. Maria wept when she heard his voice. "She was so cruel to your father in the end, Mijo," she whispered over the phone, always telling him he was confused, that his memory was failing. She kept him away from everyone. David, the driver, was hesitant at first, afraid of repercussions, but his loyalty to Robert won out. She had me take her to meetings, strange ones with a man who wasn't a lawyer, and she was always carrying thick folders of documents out of the house, never. The puzzle was taking shape. 3 weeks after he'd stumbled out of that coffee shop, he had a small but growing file of damning information. He met Maria in a quiet park. She handed him a small box. "I kept these," she said. "Letters your mother wrote to your father. Victoria threw them in the trash. I couldn't let her." More importantly, Maria told him about Victoria's constant online searches. She was always looking up medications, things to help him relax, she said. And printed out articles. I saw one about a drug that can cause confusion and lethargy in elderly patients. I didn't think, but now the blood ran cold in Michael's veins. His meeting with David was even more revealing. He confirmed the secret trips and the meetings with the mysterious man. "He looked like a playboy, not a businessman," David said. "She met him at a hotel bar twice a week. And your dad, he signed things without even looking. He'd just stare out the window, looking so tired." She'd just put the pen in his hand and point. The retired secretary, Margaret, provided the financial keys to the kingdom. Over tea, she sketched out a timeline of corporate restructuring that began a month after the wedding. Assets had been moved to newly created LLCs with Victoria as a managing partner. Robert's majority shares in the parent company had been diluted through a series of complex transactions he never would have approved in his right mind. The final piece was the most expensive and the most terrifying. Michael took the $1,000 from the envelope, the blood money, and hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank. He gave him everything he had on Victoria, including the name from the Nevada marriage license. A week later, Frank called him. "You need to sit down for this," he said. The report was explosive. Victoria Blackwood was an alias. Her real name was Helen Petrov. She had been married 3 times before. Her first husband, A.E., wealthy tech entrepreneur, had died of a heart attack at 45. She inherited everything. Her second, the real estate developer from Nevada, had died in a boating accident. She inherited everything. The third had his fortune wiped out in a series of bad investments she had overseen before he took his own life. Each time, she had changed her name and moved to a new state, targeting wealthy, lonely widowers. She wasn't just a gold digger. She was a professional predator, a black widow who had perfected her craft. 2 months after he had been cast out, Michael was no longer the same person. The soft, grieving son was gone, burned away by the fires of betrayal and rage. In his place stood a man forged in cold fury. He was thinner, his face was leaner, and his eyes held a hard, unyielding focus. His grief had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into fuel. On the floor of Sarah's spare room, he had it all laid out. Copies of documents, sworn affidavits, from Maria and David, Margaret's financial analysis, and Frank's devastating report on Helen Petrov. He had enough to destroy her in court. He had enough to put her in prison. But he wanted more than that. He wanted justice for his father, a man who had been manipulated, isolated, and possibly slowly poisoned until he was no longer himself. The public humiliation this would cause his family name was a heavy price, but the truth was more important. A plan began to form in his mind. Strategy not just for a courtroom, but for a public execution of her character. He knew exactly when and where he would do it. He just needed the invitation. And he knew, with her arrogance, she would give it to him. He was ready. Finally. The day arrived cloaked in a cruel, brilliant sunlight. The sky was an endless, mocking blue, the kind of perfect autumn day his father had loved. Michael stood in front of his closet at Sarah's apartment, a space he'd occupied for what felt like a lifetime. He chose his suit with the precision of a soldier, selecting his armor. A dark navy wool, impeccably tailored, a suit his father had bought him a few years back for a business award ceremony. It felt right. It felt like he was bringing his father with him. In his briefcase, he had the file, every document perfectly organized. He had a small, high-fidelity audio recorder in his pocket and a USB drive containing the digital copies. His lawyer, Jessica, was waiting in a car, block away from the church. The private investigator, Frank, was positioned across the street just in case. Sarah was his emotional anchor, squeezing his hand before he left the apartment. "You can do this," she said, her eyes full of a belief that had sustained him through the darkest nights. He drove his own car, an older sedan that was a world away from the luxury vehicles parked in the church lot. Arriving at the funeral felt surreal. This was the church where he'd been baptized. The place where his mother's own service had been held. Now it was the stage for the final act of Victoria's deception. He saw the notice in the paper that morning. Robert Thompson, beloved husband, visionary entrepreneur, passed away peacefully. A private service would be held for close family and friends. He knew he was the one person she didn't want there, which was exactly why he had to come. He saw them as he approached, the city's elite, business partners, old family friends. All dressed in somber black, their faces etched with polite practiced grief. They were her audience. As he walked up the stone steps, a murmur went through the crowd. People stopped talking, heads turned. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and judgment. He was the prodigal son, the estranged child who had abandoned his dying father. He saw Victoria standing near the entrance, greeting guests. She was the picture of the grieving widow, dressed in a custom-made black dress, a delicate veil partially obscuring her face. She was flanked by two formidable-looking men who were clearly private security. She saw him, and for a fraction of a second, her mask of sorrow slipped. He saw a flash of pure, unadulterated rage in her eyes, before it was quickly replaced by a look of pained surprise. She moved to intercept him before he could enter the church, her security guards falling into step behind her. "Michael," she whispered, her voice a perfect blend of sadness and admonishment. "I asked you not to come. This is a private day for those who truly loved Robert. You have no right to be here." "I have every right," he said, his voice low but steady, refusing to let the crowd see him rattled. "I'm his son." "A son who took money to disappear," she hissed, the venom in her voice barely concealed. "A son who couldn't be bothered to visit. Don't make a scene. It would be disrespectful to his memory." A scene. Michael. Allowed a cold smile to touch his lips. "Victoria, you have no idea what a scene is, but you're about to find out." He pushed past her, ignoring her gasp of outrage, and the guards who made a half-hearted move to stop him. He walked into the cavernous sanctuary and took a seat in the front pew, the one reserved for immediate family. The organ was playing a somber hymn. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, a smell he would forever associate with death. People were staring. Whispering. He ignored them. He was here for one person only, and he wouldn't be moved. The service began. A minister who barely knew his father spoke in vague, pleasant terms about Robert's generosity and community spirit. A business partner gave a eulogy about his professional brilliance. Then Victoria walked to the pulpit. Theatrically, she lifted her veil, revealing eyes glistening with what appeared to be unshed tears. She began to speak about her beloved husband. Her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She painted a picture of their life together, a romantic fantasy of a man who had found true love late in life. Then she turned her attention to the final, painful days. "It was a deep sadness to Robert," she said, her voice catching, "that in his final weeks his own son, Michael, chose to distance himself. Robert was a man who valued loyalty above all else, and this abandonment broke his heart." The words were a direct assault, designed to cement his status as the villain in her narrative. He felt the judgment of the entire church settle upon him. That was his cue. As she paused for a dramatic effect, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, Michael stood up. "That's a lie," he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the suddenly silent church. Every head snapped in his direction. Victoria froze at the pulpit, her face a mask of shock. "You're lying. You kept me from him." "Michael, please," she stammered, trying to regain control. "This is not the time or the place." "This is the only place," he shot back, taking a step into the aisle. He pulled the small audio recorder from his pocket and held it up. "Because you're not the only one who can put on a performance. I have one of my own. From our little meeting at the coffee shop." He pressed play. His own voice, shaky and broken, filled the sanctuary. "Why are you doing this?" Then came Victoria's, cold and clear. "Your father is dying." "Michael, decide now. Money and peace, or a legal war you can't afford." A collective gasp went through the pews. He then played the second part, the part recorded after he had left, the part that would be her undoing. Her voice, now stripped of all pretense, dripped with triumphant greed. "Done, honey. The idiot took it. Now the 3 million is all ours. As soon as the old man dies, we'll get married and disappear." A man's voice, unfamiliar but smug, replied on the recording. "You're a genius, Helen. You always were." The name Helen hung in the air like a poisoned dart. Victoria, or Helen, went pale beneath her veil. The silence in the church was absolute, a crushing, heavy void. Her carefully constructed world had just been obliterated in 30 seconds of audio. She stared at Michael, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and panic. That's doctored. It's a fake. He's crazy," she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "Is it?" Michael said. calmly, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Then maybe you can explain this." He walked to the front of the church and placed the first document on the edge of the pulpit. It was a copy of a Nevada marriage license for Helen Petroff and a real estate developer named Alan Holloway. "Or this," he continued, adding a second document. "Alan Holloway's death certificate, citing a boating accident." "Or this." A third document, the last will of a tech entrepreneur from California, leaving his day. Entire estate to his new wife, Helen Petrov, just weeks before his sudden heart attack. He kept going, document after document, laying them out like a poker hand she couldn't possibly beat. Frank's entire investigation, a biography of her predatory life, was now on display for everyone to see. The crowd was in an uproar. People were standing up, shouting, pulling out their phones to record. Victoria's lover, a handsome man in his 40s sitting in the third row, tried to slip out, but Frank, the investigator, was suddenly there, blocking the aisle. The minister was babbling, trying to restore order. Victoria, cornered and exposed, completely lost her composure. She began screaming at Michael, a torrent of curses and threats. Her mask of the grieving widow shattered into a million pieces, revealing the monster underneath. That's when the police arrived. Two uniformed officers walked calmly down the central aisle, drawn by a call Jessica had made the moment she heard. The commotion. They approached the pulpit, where Victoria was now hysterically trying to gather the documents to make them disappear. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm, "we need you to come with us." She was escorted out of the church, screaming and struggling, the dream of her $3 million inheritance turning to ash. The funeral had become a spectacle of justice. As she was led away, her eyes met Michael's one last time. There was no remorse in them. Only a promise of pure, undiluted hatred. In the now chaotic church, Michael stood alone beside his father's casket. The fight was over. The truth was out. He placed a hand on the polished wood. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, tears finally streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. It wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. But it was, at long last, the beginning of the truth." The days that followed were a strange, hollow echo of the storm. The chaos of the funeral gave way to the Methodical, grinding machinery of the legal system, Michael spent hours in sterile police interview rooms and lawyers' offices, recounting the story over and over until the words felt smooth and worn, like stones in a river. The media frenzy was relentless. Headlines screamed from newspapers and websites. Funeral firestorm, son exposes Black Widow stepmother. The Thompson tragedy, a web of lies and greed. He became an unwilling celebrity, his face splashed across screens, a symbol of a family drama that had captivated the public. He was forced to retreat to Sarah's apartment, the curtains drawn, unplugging from a world that wanted to consume his grief as entertainment. The legal battle was fought on two fronts. The criminal case against Victoria, or Helen Petrov, as the world now knew her, grew more damning by the day. The recording, the financial records, and the testimony from the former staff were just the beginning. The most chilling development came when, with Michael's reluctant permission, his father's body was exhumed. The autopsy revealed traces of a powerful, unprescribed sedative in his system, a drug known to cause confusion, weakness, and, in a body already ravaged by cancer, cardiac arrest. It wasn't just manipulation, it was a slow, deliberate poisoning. The charges were upgraded to include suspicion of homicide. Her lover, the man on the recording, was arrested as a co-conspirator. It turned out he had a history of fraud. Himself, a perfect partner in her predatory enterprise, simultaneously Jessica Ramirez waged war in civil court. She filed for an immediate annulment of the marriage on the grounds of fraud, arguing that Robert had married a fictional persona with the sole intent of stealing his assets. The evidence was so overwhelming that Victoria's lawyers, seeing no viable defense, barely put up a fight. A judge declared the marriage void, legally erasing her from the Thompson family history, as if she had never existed. All asset transfers made to her during the marriage were reversed. Every account was frozen, every piece of property she had put in her name was returned to Robert's estate. The mansion, which had become her fortress, was now just a silent, empty house, a crime scene tainted with the ghosts of what had happened there. Michael was given the keys, but for the first week he couldn't bring himself to cross the threshold. The house was cold. It felt sterile and alien, stripped of any warmth or personality he remembered. Victoria's minimalist art still hung on the walls. Her soulless grey furniture still occupied the spaces where his mother's comfortable, cherished pieces once sat. It wasn't a home. It was a monument to a successful invasion. The first few times he walked through the rooms, he felt a suffocating mix of anger and sorrow. This was where his father had spent his last months, a prisoner in his own home, slowly being convinced he was losing his mind. Michael felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. How had he not seen? How had he let her isolate him so completely? He sat in his father's study, the one place she hadn't completely altered, and saw the indentations on the leather desk blotter where Robert had signed away his life's work. He could almost see his father there, tired and confused, with her hand guiding his. It was Jessica who helped him reframe it. "This wasn't a failure on your part, Michael," she told him during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "Your father was the victim of a professional psychological predator. She did to him what cult leaders do to their followers. You can't blame yourself for not knowing how to fight a monster you didn't even know existed." Her words, combined with the grim validation of the autopsy report, began to slowly shift his perspective. His father hadn't been weak. He had been ill, drugged, and masterfully manipulated. His love for his father, which had become complicated by feelings of anger and disappointment, clarified once more into pure, uncomplicated grief for the man who had been stolen from him long before he died. The turning point came when Jessica's legal team located his father's original will, drafted 5 years prior, and lodged safely with a separate law firm Victoria hadn't known about. It was simple and clear. Everything was left to Michael, his only son, with a touching handwritten addendum about how proud he was of the man he had become. Reading those words felt like hearing his father's voice one last time, a message from beyond the grave that cut through all of Victoria's lies. It was the permission he needed to start again. His first act of reclamation was in the house. He spent a weekend systematically erasing Victoria. He took down her art, boxed up her clothes, and had every piece of her furniture hauled away and donated. Then he went into the attic and unsealed the boxes Maria had tearfully told him she'd hidden there. Inside were his mother's things, her paintings, her books, the family photographs Victoria had taken down. He spent hours putting them back, restoring the house's memory, its soul. He hung a large portrait of his parents, young and smiling over the fireplace. For the first time in years, the house began to feel like home again. His next move was at the company. He called an emergency board meeting. He walked in, not as the grieving son, but as the new owner. His voice was steady and firm as he laid out the future of Thompson Construction. He fired the two senior executives who had enabled Victoria, who had stood by and watched as she dismantled his father's legacy. He promoted loyal, long-time employees who embodied his father's principles of integrity and hard work. He was no longer just his father's son, he was his successor. But the money, the power, the company, it all felt different now. The trauma had changed. His relationship with wealth. It wasn't a prize to be enjoyed. It was a responsibility to be wielded. He knew he couldn't just go back to his old life. He had seen the dark underbelly of loneliness and vulnerability that predators like Victoria exploited. A few months after the funeral, he used a significant portion of his inheritance to establish the Robert Thompson Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal aid and support for victims of elder abuse and predatory. Relationships. His story, now a tool for good, helped to raise awareness and attract powerful allies. The news of Victoria's trial brought unexpected consequences. As her real name and methods became public, other families came forward. The sons and daughters of her previous husbands, who had long harbored suspicions but lacked proof, now had a voice. A network of victims was formed, and Michael found himself at its center, not as a leader, but as a fellow survivor. His personal. Relationships were also filtered through the crucible of his ordeal. The fair-weather friends who had vanished when he was disinherited came calling again, their voices oozing with false sympathy. He politely and permanently cut them out of his life. His true circle was small but unbreakable. Sarah, who had given him a home when he had none, and Jessica, the brilliant, tenacious lawyer who had become his closest confidant. A quiet, tentative romance was beginning to blossom between. Him and Jessica, built not on whirlwind passion, but on a deep, shared understanding and mutual respect. She had seen him at his absolute lowest and had helped him find his strength. With her, he felt safe enough to be vulnerable again. 6 months after the funeral, the trial began. Michael sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day. He needed to see it through to the end. Victoria, stripped of her designer clothes and expensive lawyers, looked like a different person. She was haggard, her face a permanent mask of bitter resentment. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts: fraud, theft, and first-degree murder. The judge, calling her actions the epitome of calculated evil, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As they led her away in handcuffs, she didn't look at the jury or the judge. She looked directly at Michael, her eyes burning with a hatred that would likely never die. He felt no triumph, no joy, no satisfaction. He only felt a profound, bone-deep relief. The weight he had been carrying for so long finally lifted. He walked out of the courthouse, past the scrum of reporters, and didn't look back. "Justice has been done for my father," was all he said. "Now it's time for him to rest in peace, and for me to live." 2 years had passed since the day of the funeral. 2 years since his world had cracked open and been rebuilt on a foundation of hard-won truth. The Michael Thompson of today was a different man, forged in a fire he never asked for. The raw, desperate grief had settled into a quiet strength, the frantic anger into a focused purpose. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady gaze that saw the world with a clarity he hadn't known was possible. He was no longer the boy who had inherited his father's business, but the man who had earned his father's legacy. The mansion was a home again. He had walked through its rooms, once a cold testament to Victoria's conquest, and had painstakingly infused them with life and memory. His mother's warm, colourful paintings hung on the walls, and the scent of lemon oil and fresh flowers, the way he remembered it from childhood, had finally chased away the sterile metallic smell of Victoria's reign. He'd had his father's study restored to exactly how it was before she came, down to the worn leather of the armchair and the collection of architectural books. On the shelves, it was no longer a crime scene, but a place of quiet reflection. He often sat there in the evenings, not mourning what was lost, but celebrating what had been. His relationship with his father was no longer complicated by the trauma of his last months. It was a conversation with the man who had taught him how to build things that last. At Thompson Construction, he was a leader his father would have been proud of. He led not with the inherited authority of his name, but with an empathy and integrity born from his own ordeal. He implemented new policies that supported his employees, creating a culture of loyalty that money could never buy. The company thrived, its reputation for quality work now matched by a reputation for ethical leadership. He found a quiet satisfaction in the work, in seeing blueprints turn into homes where families would be safe, a concept that now held a profound and sacred meaning for him. He was building the one thing he had been denied, sanctuaries. But the work that gave him the deepest pride, the work that was the true alchemy of his pain, was the Robert Thompson Foundation. It had started as an idea born from helplessness and had grown into a formidable force for justice. Housed in a downtown office, not far from the courthouse where Victoria had been sentenced, the foundation was a beacon for those trapped in the same darkness he had escaped. They provided a multifaceted defense against predators. A team of pro bono lawyers, led by a semi-retired but brilliant litigator who would fight fraudulent wills and annul predatory marriages. They employed private investigators, like Frank, to unearth the hidden histories of manipulators. They offered trauma counseling with psychologists who understood the specific terror of familial betrayal, and they even maintained a small, discreet apartment building, Robert's Haven, for victims who had been thrown out of their homes and left with nothing. Michael was not a distant benefactor. He was on the front lines. He often met with new victims himself, listening to their stories in a quiet room that looked more like a living room than an office. He heard his own story echoed in theirs. The sudden isolation, the gaslighting, the missing documents, the chilling realization that a loved one had been turned into a stranger. One case in particular stayed with him. A woman named Eleanor, whose elderly mother had recently married. A much younger man. Within 6 months, Eleanor was blocked from visiting. Her mother's health was mysteriously declining, and a new will had appeared, leaving everything to the new husband. Eleanor's story was so eerily similar to his own that it felt like a ghost from his past. The foundation immediately took her case. They got a court order for a wellness check. Their investigator uncovered the new husband's history of debt and fraud, and their lawyers filed an emergency injunction. To block him from controlling her mother's assets. They won. They got Eleanor's mother into the care of a proper doctor who discovered she was being over-medicated into a state of constant confusion. They had the marriage annulled, and Eleanor was restored as her mother's guardian. The day the final court order came through, Eleanor came to the Foundation's office and just held Michael's hands, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "You saved her life," she whispered. "No." Michael replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "We saved each other." In her victory, he saw the justice he had fought for his own father ripple outward, becoming a shield for others. He had turned his worst nightmare into someone else's hope. His personal life had also found a new, quiet rhythm. His relationship with Jessica had blossomed into a partnership of profound trust and affection. It was a love story written not in grand gestures, but in shared silences, late night. Conversations, and the simple comfort of knowing he had a partner who had seen every one of his scars and loved him, not in spite of them, but because of them. She never tried to fix him. She simply stood with him as he healed himself. He knew he would likely ask her to marry him one day, but there was no rush. Their foundation was already stronger than any legal document. His friendship with Sarah remained one of the pillars of his life. She was a constant, joyous presence, a reminder. Of the unconditional kindness that had been his lifeline. They were his family, a small, tightly knit unit forged in crisis and bound by a loyalty that was real and true. He learned to enjoy his wealth not for the luxury it afforded, but for the freedom it gave him, the freedom to build the foundation, to travel to the quiet, unassuming places his father had always wanted to see, to live a life of purpose rather than opulence. He still went to therapy once a month, a check-in to ensure. The ghosts of the past stayed where they belonged. He understood that healing wasn't a destination one arrived at, but a landscape one learned to navigate. Sometimes, when people asked him about what he went through, they would ask if it was worth it. The question always made him pause. Would he trade the man he had become to erase the pain he had endured? The answer was a complicated, resounding no. He had lost a naive, protected version of himself, a man who believed in the inherent. Goodness of the world, but he had gained a man who understood the world's capacity for both darkness and light, and who had chosen, actively, to fight for the light. The trauma had destroyed him, But in the ruins, he had rebuilt himself into someone stronger, more compassionate, and more resilient than he had ever thought possible. He rarely thought of Victoria. She was a closed chapter, a cautionary tale. He received a sterile legal notification once a year that her appeal had been denied. It didn't bring him pleasure, only a quiet confirmation that justice was holding firm. He felt no burning hatred for her anymore, only a distant, clinical pity for a life so consumed by greed that it had to be lived by destroying others. Forgiveness was not and would never be on the table. Some acts were so fundamentally evil they existed outside the realm of pardon. But he had freed himself from her grip. She was in a physical prison, but he had escaped the mental one. She had built for him. His love for his father, once clouded by the pain of his final days, was now clear and strong. He understood his father's loneliness, the vulnerability that Victoria had exploited, and he loved him all the more for his very human frailty. In a strange reversal of roles, he now felt like his father's protector, safeguarding his memory and turning his name into a symbol of hope. On a recent, crisp autumn morning, Michael was in the backyard of the mansion. The rose, garden his mother had planted, the one Victoria had ripped out, was now thriving again. He had found his mother's old gardening journals and, with the help of a patient landscaper, had restored it exactly as she designed it. As the sun warmed his face, he felt a sense of peace that was deep and real. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was the director of the foundation. He answered, his voice calm and experienced. Michael Thompson. He listened intently as a new story unfolded on. The other end of the line, a son in another city, a suspicious new caregiver, a father's sudden cognitive decline. He recognized the pattern instantly. He began to strategize, his mind clear, his resolve firm. "Okay," he said, walking slowly through the blooming roses. "Tell him not to worry. We're going to help him. Tell him his story matters. We'll start by..." His story was not unique. He knew that now. It was a silent epidemic, playing out in quiet homes and sterile hospital rooms, all. Over the country, families were being destroyed by greed, lives were being shattered by manipulation. But his story was also one of resistance, a testament to a son who refused to be erased. He had learned that justice is not always swift or easy, but it is always worth fighting for. For anyone else out there, lost in the same darkness, his life was now the message. Your pain is real. Your anger is justified. You are not alone. There is a path through the darkness, and on the other, side is not the person you were before, but the person you become. He had not won by simply getting back what he had lost. He had won by becoming someone Victoria could never have imagined, a man too strong to be broken, too wise to be manipulated again, and too free in his purpose to ever be controlled. He had lost his innocence, but he had found himself, and in the end, that was everything he needed.